Catherine the Great, Chapter 3. Paul turned the page of his mother's diary, intending to read further, but stopped at the entry date. It was December 31st, 1744. Catherine had written in one of the previous entries that she considered a fortnight to be a long time between entries. Yet here it seemed 9 months had gone by since she had written in her diary. Paul turned the open face of the book into the candlelight and looked closely. Only a small looseness of the binding and a tiny scrap of torn paper caught in one of the center strings revealed anything amiss, but he realized that several pages had been carefully removed from the book. He crossed to his mother's desk and once again drew out a bundle from the bottom of the stack. The label slipped into the ribbon securing the bundles, identified it as Elizabeth, August 1744, October 1744. Kiev, August 14th, 1744. Dear Catherine, I am sorry to tell you that Peter is very ill. Last week he developed some kind of stomach complaint, which continues to give him much pain. The doctors have prescribed purges and, of course, bloodletting, but nothing seems to have helped him at all. Indeed, the doctors argue about whether or not the cause is gastronomic or organic. He eats almost nothing and can bear to drink only a little water. For the time being, at least, my dear, we must abandon our plans for you to join Peter and me here in Kiev. He is so sick to take part in any official activities, and your time would be best spent in Moscow. I intend to remain here with Peter and to supervise his treatment. E. Kiev, September 1st, 1744. Dear Catherine, I regret to tell you that Grand Duke Peter's condition has deteriorated. He has eaten very little food for more than 2 weeks now, and still the doctors cannot determine exactly what is wrong with him. More and more, I fear he may be sickening with another ailment, as well as the problem with his stomach. Over the last 3 days, he has developed a fever that seems to attack him most at night. The letters you have sent each day are a comfort to Peter and are welcome. I have ordered prayers to be said for him and asked that you to pray for his swift recovery. E. Kiev, September 5th, 1744. Dear Catherine, one mystery at least has been cleared. The fever that attacked Peter last week has developed into measles. Mercifully, the doctors are sure of this and know how to treat it. He is to drink as much as clean water as possible and to lie in a darkened room. The stomach ailment, although still having its effects, seems to have significantly diminished. There has still not been a satisfactory diagnosis made as to what the problem has been. Both Peter and I are much obliged to you for the letters you have sent him to encourage his recovery. His spirits are always lifted when he receives them. E. Kiev, September 25th, 1744. Dear Catherine, the Grand Duke's condition is improved. His measles have abated and the stomach illness, which remains of unknown origins, seems to have gone from him. However, he is much weakened and is in great need of a comfortable convalescence. I have been thinking for some time that I would make the journey home as soon as he is well enough to travel. If we leave it much longer, I am afraid that the weather will prevent us moving from the whole of the winter. We must leave within the next few days. However, I do not intend to make for Moscow. Instead, I will take the Grand Duke to St. Petersburg. He will recuperate there for much more comfortably. We will arrive in St. Petersburg in mid-October, so make your way there to greet us when we arrive. Our prayers for Grand Duke's continuing life are heard. It is thanks to God that my nephew, your future husband, has returned to us. E. En route Kiev, St. Petersburg, October 10th, 1744, by dispatch rider. Dear Catherine, this journey has become a nightmare. Peter is desperately ill once again. The doctors traveling with us say that it is a pneumonia. The good autumn weather is holding, and we are making good time in our journey. We will arrive in St. Petersburg on October 15th or 16th. Come to us there, Catherine. Peter is in very poor spirits. I am sure he will benefit from your attendance. E. En route Kiev, St. Petersburg, October 11, 1744, by dispatch rider. A calamity, Catherine. Peter has smallpox. The first blisters showed themselves this morning, and now the doctors are sure. We are traveling through the hours of darkness now, as well as by day, and we will arrive in St. Petersburg on the 13th. Do not come to St. Petersburg. The danger from the disease is too great. Your prayers and your notes to Grand Duke are welcome and needed more than ever before, Catherine. But the danger from the disease is too much for you to see him. I will isolate Peter at the Winter Palace and nurse him myself. E. Paul moved to the fireplace and pulled a bell sash to summon the footman. The man entered almost immediately, and Paul motioned towards the fire to tell him to remake it. As the servant worked, Paul sat at the desk, pulling all the diaries and bundles of letters out of the two bottom drawers. He placed them carefully in order on the floor, earliest days furthest away from the desk. When the drawer was empty, Paul moved too close to close it. It did not slide as he imagined. It would. Paul was not stuck or obstructed in any way, yet somehow it was too heavy to move easily. He pulled it out as far as it would come, and gently lifted the freed end, testing its weight. Evidently, there is more to the drawer than immediately met the eye. Paul took up the candle in his holder from the desk and brought it down closer to the drawer. He began to see no reason for the drawer's heaviness and began to doubt his own judgment. Perhaps the timber from which the desk was built was particularly hard and heavy, but still it nagged at his mind that things were not as they seemed. Absent-mindedly, he watched the servant working. Two large bronze boxes, one on either side of the fire, were filled with firewood each day, and their contents used as fuel. The one on the right was empty, and the footman was cleaning it. Paul saw his carefully lift the false bottom that was there to protect the bronze base that being damaged as the axed wood was thrown in. The man swept beneath the false bottom and then replaced it, letting it drop with a gentle thump. Suddenly, Paul looked again at the drawer within the understanding. It did not appear as deep as it might imagine for a bottom drawer in what was quite a large desk. He looked carefully at the timber base of the drawer and saw that at last that it did not fit as closely as it might expect. He tried pushing it hard down abruptly, and then with great force it sprang free, sharply striking Paul's knuckles as the front end rose to reveal a cavity beneath. Paul brought the candle closer. The cavity was full to its limit. There were many pages torn from Catherine's diary. There were bundles of letters and other documents. In contrast to the papers, that had been in the upper part of the drawer, neatly bundled and properly labeled. The material in the lower portion was untidily pushed in and not strewed or labeled at all. He reached in to gather it and pull it out. Paul dismissed the servant, and he remembered as the man left that he should ask for news of his mother. But he was anxious to read. In spite of the confusion of the sheets of paper, the pages missing from the 1744 diary were easily found. Paul moved closer to the fire and took up his mother's story. St. Petersburg, April 17, 1744. A lot happened in the short time since I last wrote. My title is no longer the Princess Sophia. I am now Catherine, Grand Duchess of Russia. The Empress has given me a household and a small court of my own, and a generous allowance with which to pay my servants and dressmakers. Mother has completely turned away from me. I understand the problem. It is simply that she is jealous. I now have a much more powerful position than she has. She resents having to walk behind me. She hates being sat in a different table at court functions, and most of all, she is unhappy at having to share an apartment with one of the palace governess on a lower floor. Although she and I never been close, I feel sorry for the way things have turned out between mother and me. Now I have come to understand something of the way things are done in Russia, and the constant attention that affairs of the court needed. I can see that it is most unlikely that I will ever see Anhalt again. Mother is my only remaining link to both my family and my homeland. She is determined to leave as soon as my wedding day is over. Moscow, May 2nd, 1744. I am glad to be back in Moscow without either the Empress or Peter. They had gone off to Kiev. I have to say that I am relieved to be free of both of them for a while. Elizabeth has made me a kind court favorite, almost like a daughter to her. This has its advantages, of course, but she also demands swift and absolute obedience. I have little choice in almost anything I do, or the people I speak to, or even the clothes I wear. She governs everything, and it is getting very difficult to bite my lip and say nothing. Even more difficult to be continually grateful. I do not have mother's knack for being able to say one thing and mean the other, and so I am always worried that I might say or do something that will get me in trouble. And as for Peter, the Grand Duke, what a whining, miserable child he is. He is 16 and would still rather play with his wooden nursery toys, his carts and building bricks, his toy soldiers and his mechanical engines that learn anything interesting or make friends among the people of his own age. And I am expected to marry him. A day or two before he left for Kiev, Peter flew into a childish tantrum because he said the Swedish ambassador did not pay enough attention to a toy bow and arrow, and he had taken to court to play with it. It was an embarrassing scene, with the Grand Duke lying on the floor in tears, violently kicking his heels, and the ambassador not knowing whether to treat him as a mentally retarded person or the future emperor of all Russia. Paul read the page after page of his mother's dislike for his father. No wonder she had hidden these diary entries. Then there were other pages of remarks about people in court. Some names he recognized and high-ranking officials, one or two people who had mysteriously died or disappeared, and yet others whose names Paul had never come across before. He realized that he was reading about court politics and about the way people acted against their rivals and supported their friends. His mother must have been involved in such plots that schemes very early in her career. The next entry Paul found in that concentrated his father was dated August 21st, 1744. It would have taken about 6 or 7 days for a horseman to bring the palace mail from Kiev to Moscow. Catherine must have made this entry almost immediately. She heard from the Empress Elizabeth and about Peter's illness. Moscow, August 21st, 1744. Peter is ill. I hope this keeps him in Kiev longer. Moscow, September 9th, 1744. Peter is worse. Several people here in Moscow died last year from measles. I hardly dare write and I hope he will die, but this is the truth. The idea of being married to him fills me with disdain, and it would be better for me if Peter dies not live. Moscow, October 3rd, 1744. So Peter has recovered. Well, what must be, I suppose. I do not want his death on my conscience. I felt quite hypocritical leading prayers here in Moscow for his recovery and secretly hoping for him to die. Moscow, October 16, 1744. I feel pulled into two directions about the news that Peter is ill with smallpox. On the one hand, I feel sorry for him. He seems to have suffered so much, and smallpox is such a terrible death. On the other hand, I am convinced that Russia would be better off without him as a ruler, and to have married him still seems awful to me. I dread it. But I am full of admiration for the Empress. By nursing Peter herself, she is risking her own life. She is a very brave woman. Paul searched among the papers for more of his mother's 1744 diary, but could find none. He stared at the fire and thought. He wondered if he had inherited his own poor health from his father. Like Peter, Paul has often been ill as a child, but he knew his mother had rarely looked after him. The Empress Elizabeth and one of her servants, a nurse, who acted as Paul's nanny, had been ones to care for him through nearly all his childhood problems. But he recalled one episode of illness when his mother had cared for him. Pneumonia had kept him in bed for weeks during the winter months. His 9th birthday was remembered rather than celebrated, and several people had come to his bedroom to see him, propped in bed, looking weak and pale. Now he could not help thinking that perhaps the care given to him as a child had been more than to do with dynastic and political concerns than for the sake of family love. Even while his father was close to death, his mother had been involved in court plots and intrigues. There seemed no end to them. The more Paul read in the diaries and letters, the more he understood that he had never really known his mother at all. A sheet of notepaper smaller than the others had fallen to the floor. Paul picked it up and read. St. Petersburg, December 20th, 1744. Dear Catherine, God has heard our prayers. The Grand Duke is recovered and is himself again after so many months. Both the Grand Duke and I have very much appreciated the many attentions and kindness in the letters and presents you have sent during these most difficult times. I have delayed replying to them until I was sure that letter to you would bear good news. Finally, I am assure you that our great relief and joy in giving thanks to God, the Grand Duke has come back to us. I will send word about when a meeting between you and he can take place. It was just come to Paul's mind that nearly 2 hours must have passed since he had heard news from his mother, when a quiet knock came at the study door. "Come," called Paul, and the same footman had seen before entered, holding a small silver mail tray. Paul took the note that it held and opened it. It told him that the Empress had been moved to to a bedroom within the royal apartments. He knew this meant that the doctors had decided there was nothing more that could be done for Catherine, and that was she would to die in suitably royal surroundings. Other family members would be gathered at her bedside and at their prayers. Even through his concern for his mother was limited to the timing of her death and his own inheritance of her titles, Paul felt that he should at least make a show attending her deathbed. He placed the diary and the letters in their correct places in the sequence of documents he had arranged on the floor. Glancing at the large mirror that hung over the fireplace, he smoothed his hair back with his hand. He straightened his jacket, and after a regretful glance at the papers on the floor, which he longed to continue reading, he left the study and carefully looked at the door behind him. Slipping the large old key into his jacket pocket, he made his way through the long palace corridors to the hospital. The whole building, with all its life, its servants and guests, its government offices, and its kitchen, seems to be holding his breath. The people he met curtsied and bowed to him as he passed. They spoke among themselves in whispers and quiet, serious voices. In her vast bed, surrounded by doctors, attendants, and servants, the Empress of all Russia looked smaller than Paul remembered. He hardly recognized her without her wig and heavy makeup. Her face was pale gray color, and her skin had a kind of paper quality, delicate but somehow unnatural. She lay on her back, her head supported by the pillows. Her breathing was shallow, and her lungs struggled to complete each cycle of breathing. Paul stayed at the bedside only as long as he thought it took to make himself seem respectable, interested in his mother. The truth, he realized, was that he cared almost nothing for her. Even the search through her diaries entry, interesting though it was more from family point of view, was really aimed at finding Catherine's will and some authority to say that she had passed the succession of the Russian throne to him. After an hour he left, telling the doctors that he wanted immediate news of every change, no matter how slight. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon when Paul let himself back into his mother's study. The short day had already turned to a night, and the room was in darkness except for what was left of the smoldering fire. Paul rang for the servant to rebuild the fire, and while he waited for the man to come, lit all the candles he could find himself. In the new light, he looked around at the ornaments, books, and odd pieces of furniture that crowded the study. His mother had never thrown anything away. The accumulation of her half-century reign lay all about him. He shivered with the thought of the life and death decisions and the intrigues that had begun begun here in this room. Paul had Paul was glad when the servant entered and interrupted his train of thought, and as the man worked to and turned once again to his mother's diaries. The journal for 1745 seemed slim compared with the others, but Paul noted how loose the binding was and wondered how many pages had been removed and were to be found in the secret compartment. "Will there be anything else, Your Highness?" "No." The man turned to leave. "Wait," he said. "Get me a meal. Some roast meat and new bread." "Yes, Your Highness. Shall I bring it here, or would you prefer eating at the dining room?" "Here, of course." When the man had gone, Paul opened his mother's diary from 1745. Immediately, a letter that had been enclosed between the front cover and the first page fell to the floor. Paul did not recognize the rigidly upright handwriting or the formal style. It was written in French. Stettin, January 8, 1745. Your Royal Highness, the Grand Duchess Catherine of Russia, please accept my congratulations and those of my court on our forthcoming marriage to Peter, the Grand Duke of Russia. The honor that is done to my principality by your union with the most gracious royal family of Russia will be forever remembered and humbly recognized as being to its advantage. However, although I freely acknowledge the power and majesty given to your Highness over us, I beg your Highness to reconsider your decision to immerse yourself in the religion of Russians. In your growing years, you were shown the true religion, the one that God has demanded of us. To turn away from the path now will be to your disadvantage, and to the eventual disadvantage of your people. And I know that my aged years will be a torment if my mind continues to be filled with the knowledge that the true faith of God has been subverted within you. It is my wish that this letter finds your Highness in the good health and comfort. Christian Augustus. At first, Paul had racked his mind to remember who Christian Augustus was. So far as he could recall, he had never heard of his grandfather talked of it in that way. In Russia, the man was considered so insignificant that he was hardly referred to at all. On those rare occasions when the principality he governed was spoken of, it and he were referred to by the one name, Anheuser. Paul looked with interest to see Catherine's first diary entry for 1745. Moscow, January 22nd, 1745. Oh, the disappointment of it! At last, after all this time, I have received a letter from my father, and it's so cold and formal that I scarcely believe that my beloved Papa speaking. He referred to me as Your Royal Highness, the Grand Duchess Catherine of Russia. If he were here, I would kick him. If only he had written to my dear Sophie. He has turned away from me. That's the truth. I know he is very firm in his religious beliefs, but really? He seems to think I can be a member of the royal family of all Russia and not adopt the Russian religion. It's impossible. I can't. And he should know better. I don't know how to reply. How can I tell him that about the excitement and happiness I felt when the messenger brought me the letter, and the terrible unhappiness that came over me when I read it? And now I am going to St. Petersburg. I am expected the summons before this. The Empress writes that Peter is in good health and that I should leave immediately. Paul started at the abruptness with which his mother had written that she given going to St. Petersburg and then let the subject drop. He felt that there had been more on the subject, especially when he turned the paper of the diary and found that the next entry to be made close to the end of February. He began to research among the diary pages for the secret compartment and soon found two that looked as if they had been torn out of something of a hurry. Then they were scrawled into neatly written as usual. St. Petersburg, January 30th, 1745. When I last saw Peter must be at least 6 months ago. He was hardly what I described as a young woman's idea of the perfect potential husband, but now he's unpleasant to look at as well as being childish. He is so thin that he looks starved, and yet somehow his face is swollen and misshapen on one side. I suppose it has been necessary to shave his head, but why could someone have not provided him with a proper wig rather than one that makes him look clownish? Apparently, when he had smallpox, no one was able to prevent him from scratching the spots, and now horrible scars permanently disfigured him. He always did have a weak-looking face, but now is positively ugly as well. When we met, he moved towards me, obviously intending to kiss my cheek, to say hello, but I would not bring myself to allow it. I'm afraid I pulled back from contact with him. He is hideous. I had to force myself to look at him directly. Still, I managed to shake his hand and tell him I was pleased to see him, and happy that he has recovered. He seemed glad about this, and the smile he gave did improve his face a little. St. Petersburg, February 8th, 1745. I am to be married. The Empress has finally told me what I knew all along would probably be the case. She said she will make the formal public announcement tomorrow, and it looks as if my fate is sealed. I cannot avoid it. I am to marry Peter, the Grand Duke of Russia, on April 21st. How on earth can I get out of this marriage? I cannot go through with it, and yet I think I'm going to have to. I'm so deep into Russia now that I can't pull back. To go home to Anzerst is unthinkable, with both mother and father against me for reasons of their own. St. Petersburg, February 20th, 1745. No one wants to talk about anything but the wedding. The preparations seem to be the only concern of the whole empire at the moment. Although apparently I am not to be consulted about much at all, the Empress, that's all I ever hear. She has to be consulted about everything, even to be allowed to choose my own wedding dress. I had to argue with her and insist that I know my own requirements best. It's going to be a more elaborate ceremony than anything I've ever seen before, that's for certain. All the higher members of the government are to be given a year's salary in advance. This seems to me to be an unnecessary expense, but the Empress insists that they all must be what she calls properly dressed for the occasion. I think she's even going to tell them all the colors to wear. She really is bossiest woman I ever known. There are cargo ships in St. Petersburg harbor loaded with carriages made in France and Italy. Some of them even have horses with them too, and others have wagons and coming overland from the south and from China. With the silk to be made into dresses and the new jewelry to be worn by both men and ladies, a lot of this is just showing off. The Empress is making sure that the foreign diplomats who will be in Russia when the wedding takes place are impressed with all, both in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. Parties, balls, and banquets are going to be going for weeks after the wedding. I've hardly spoken to Peter at all. Of course, he is thoroughly under the Empress's control, and I had thought about trying to get him to speak with me to try to get the Empress to do one or two things differently, but it's hopeless. He's just like a little boy, really. He still plays with his toy soldiers, gets his servants to help him line them up and in the palace corridors. Then he organizes battles which his troops always win, of course, and I have to marry him. I can't tell whether to laugh at him or be sad for him, or sad for me. St. Petersburg, March 20th, 1745. The Empress has completely ignored my wishes about my wedding dress. She arranged for me to wear an awful heavy thing made of dozens of petticoats of silver colored silk. It weighs about a ton. I think I have been for four fittings. I can hardly stand upright when I'm wearing it, and it's not even finished yet. And then she insisted that on the day I am to wear another ton for her old fashioned jewelry, and it's true intends me to keep the jewelry after the ceremony. This is very generous of her, but her generosity always has a price. This is not how I have always imagined my wedding's day to be at all. Yesterday, I tried speaking seriously about the wedding plans to Peter, the Grand Duke of Russia, my future husband. He just giggled like a little boy and said I must talk to the Empress. Before this, I have felt sorry for him, repelled by him, and contemptuous of him. But yesterday was the first time I have ever felt angry with him. Moscow, April 20th, 1745. I said my goodbyes to Mother today. As she said, there will be no time for such sentiments later. She is still determined to leave Russia immediately. The wedding is over, and she has quite right to point out that to me that I will be so overwhelmed with official engagements then that goodbyes will be impossible. Saying goodbye to her was a more emotional experience for both of us than I had imagined it would be. We had never really been friends, but somehow for me she is the last scrap of my homeland that I will see. She is the last bit of my childhood. She has advised me to get rid of the thoughts of my past, not remember anything about it at all, just concentrate on Russia. And I must say that her advice seems good. It's my only path to success and I hope eventually happiness. I talked to Mother a little about how I am dreading my marriage to Peter. She pointed out to me that the royal marriages aren't about happiness at all. She said that she knows for not one single marriage among European royal families where the bride and the groom met and fell in love, and that must rid such romantic nonsense from my mind. She's right, of course. I see clearly, even though, what I must do. I am Russian now, and should try to become more so as the years pass. Royal marriages are about power and control. Even she is a selfish and greedy woman. She really does have a clear idea of how things must be. Her advice is good. So Mother and I parted not exactly in a friendly way, but on terms of understanding. She has not found a place of permanent in Russian court. I cannot help her until I have power to do so, and even then I may choose not to. It is best if she returns to Alzect. I doubt that I will ever see her or hear from her again. St. Petersburg, April 30th, 1745. I am married, 16 years old and married to a fool. The ceremony took more than 3 hours, the longest 3 hours of my life, I'm sure. Standing there is the cathedral wearing the great heavy dress and those small teeny tight shoes that hurt my feet. I thought it would never end. I enjoyed the procession through the streets, although even that was spoiled by Peter's behavior. Riding in the glided carriage with those eight perfectly matched horses could have been wonderful, even romantic, if my new husband had not insisted on giggling through the whole thing. I asked him to wave to the crowds of people who had come to see us. Many had traveled for quite far away to be there, and the streets were so overflowing that the people had some of the soldiers who were to have been in the procession had to move ahead of us to control the crowds instead. Even so, the train of carriages was nearly a half-mile long, more than 120 of them, so I have been told since. Thousands of people came to see us. Many had brought banners and flags. Fathers held their children on their shoulders, and they cheered and waved. The spring weather was just perfect. It all would have made such a wonderful occasion, but Peter thought it would be very funny to make rude gestures instead of waving. It was all well after 4 when he returned to the Winter Palace for the reception for the foreign dignitaries. Peter became tired and cross, and flew into a tantrum like a little boy. The Empress said that he was to go to his apartment to rest, which left me to meet all the visitors. Many of them had brought magnificent wedding presents. I had intended to write a personal letters of the thanks, but there are really so many that I think my secretary would have to do it. I have come to realization that I am very much alone. I cannot rely on Peter, even to help govern his own country. The worries that it brings for the future Russia are heavy to contemplate, but I have a feeling that I will have to tackle them soon. While the Empress lives, things will be all right. There was a knock on the study door, and at Paul's come, the footman entered carrying the meal Paul had ordered. The man quickly cleared the table of maps and charts and piling them on top of the other similar documents on the side desk, and then he laid the table with silver cutlery and a glass and found a dinging chair buried beneath the other pile of papers and folders. He brought the chair to the table and waited. I will serve my own food. Yes, Your Highness. Is there any news of the Empress? No, none, Your Highness. Attend to the fire now. Then you may go. Return in an hour to see to it again. As Paul ate his meal, he pondered on what he had to read and learn. He had known that his mother and father had followed different political paths. It's some sense that Paul could not yet grasp. They had been rivals. He had been only 8 years old when his father died, although when he had died of had always been something of a mystery. Now Paul could see the beginning of the problems between his parents. Catherine had evidently been more adult and mature of mind and body than his father had been. He judged that he might have been better if his father had not had the responsibility of the Russian throne to cope with. The family stories always suggested that your Empress Elizabeth had been extremely fond of Sophie, who became Catherine, from the first day they met. The mention of his mother's diary of March 20th, 1744, seemed to confirm this. However, Paul now wondered about it. The Empress must have realized that Peter would be barely fit to rule and would need a strong consort to help him. Perhaps the Empress Elizabeth's care for Catherine was more political than maternal. Until she died, Paul had been cared for not by his mother but by the Empress Elizabeth. However, at 17, he had been struck by typhoid fever. On that occasion, it had been his mother who had nursed him. She had done it carefully and tenderly, or at least it had seemed to him then. Now he wondered about her motives. Palace politics seemed to be behind everything there. There was no doubt his mother had wanted him alive. But was she driven by maternal or political reasons? Paul thought about this for a long time. His meal finished and the plate pushed to one side, and he drew a cigar from his jacket pocket and lit it, puffing in his thoughtful way. Eventually he rose, turned his back to the fire, and stood there to finish the cigar. The servant came to clear away from the dinner tray. When he had done so, Paul called him back to move the piles of diaries and papers from the floor to the table. It was just after 6 o'clock when he once more turned the document and began to read. Almost immediately, Paul noticed a difference in his reading material. It was boring. Yes, that was it. He found himself reading from diaries whose bindings were full, that had no pages missing. Its contents were all in Catherine's neat handwriting, and concerned household expenses, promotions, and gifts given to members of the Russian ruling families, horses bought and entered in the races, and profits gained from estates in faraway places. Occasionally, ambassadors and visiting travelers were mentioned, but even then only in connection with the fashions worn in the other countries, or to tell some amusing but trivial story. Sometimes a diary entry concerned some extraordinary weather or events like eclipses. The only thing that really struck Paul about his mother was the developments of her reading habits, and Catherine had noted the books she read as she completed them. They included books on Roman civilization and other history, politics, and military campaigns. There were biographies of famous statesmen and ruling queens, and books of philosophy and on Russian law. End of chapter 3.